Hello everybody and welcome back. You're tuned into the RPG Radio. My name is Winback, and on today's build in our Grimdawn build series, we're going to be playing a Saboteur. That is a Demolitionist and a Nightblade for all those uninitiated out there, and this build specifically will be focused on dealing cold and fire damage, polar opposites, along with a huge amount of mobility and some cooldown reduction to make sure that we can dip, dive, duck, and dodge as much as a chaotic cold damage cowboy ninja assassin could possibly need. If you're new to the channel, this will be the first video in a 3-part build guide series for this Saboteur. This video will be entirely based on the abilities that this class uses, so you know where to put those points all the way up through Ultimate as you get to level 100. Abilities typically won't deviate once you've got your course set chosen, so getting all the way up to Ultimate and putting those points where they belong is going to be a lot easier because you should have them all figured out by about level 50 when it comes to this build. So if you looked at the action bar down below and saw the 6 abilities that we're using in this build and thought to yourself why that requires a whole video, then I have a whole bunch of other passive options to introduce you to that will make this sound a lot more enticing. Don't worry, I know that there are 7 abilities in the action bar, but one of them is coming from a metal and an augment, so we'll talk about that when we get to that stage in the build. For now, we have a number of abilities to go through, both active and passive alike, so let's get started. You're going to need to start with your Nightblade tree because this one is going to have tons of mobility for you baked right in, along with a very big AoE damage skill that is going to help you gather a ton of experience and make sure that you level as fast as possible through normal, getting you up to level 50 and ready for elite. Before we can get there though, once you select your Nightblade tree, you're going to want to start putting points into dual blades. You can even get away with just one if you like, because 1 point into dual blades will allow you the ability to, you guessed it, use 2 weapons. 2 melee weapons as it were, but 2 weapons nonetheless. This ability, even though it is passive, however, will be very important to max out, especially going into Ultimate, because Dual Blades comes with a very important resistance, and that is going to be your physical resistance. Physical resistance caps out at 40% in Ultimate, and it is the only resistance to internal trauma, which you're going to get hit with quite a bit once you get up to that difficulty. Because it is built into the Nightblade kit, we want to have it maxed out to get as much free physical resistance out of it as possible. So once you have it all the way up to level 16, you're getting 14% physical resistance, and that is above a quarter of what is possible in that resistance field. So remember, dual blades super important later on, not a big deal early on, so hang on to some points for it later, or at least some gear that is going to help you fill out that slot. After dual blades, you're going to want to put 1 point into another passive, and that one is called the Veil of Shadow. Veil of Shadow also activates all the time, and it is going to reduce enemies in that aura. It's going to reduce their offensive ability and their total speed. So essentially they will be moving and attacking slower while also having a more difficult time hitting you. This is the first ability that it is okay to just take 1 point in period. If you end up later in the game and you're still taking too much damage, you don't want enemies to be able to hit you as often, you can put more points into Veil of Shadow because by reducing their offensive ability, their means of hitting you and critting you are going to be reduced. But I do not think that that is going to be a very big important thing for this build because it will absolutely heap damage all over the battlefield while you're playing it, especially the later it goes. The defensive stats may end up meaning even less. Now we'll go ahead and talk about the upgrade to Veil of Shadow, which you'll get later on after a couple points into your Nightblade mastery bar, but that is Night's Chill. Night's Chill is going to add to the aura of Veil of Shadow the ability to deal flat cold and frostburn damage while reducing your enemy's pierce resistance, cold resistance, as well as poison and acid resistance. This one's going to be more important for you because this is going to actively make the enemies that we hit take more damage, and considering that we should have a fairly sizable amount of offensive ability going into Ultimate, doing more damage to them with our hits and our crits is going to be very important. So resistance shredding just for existing checks all the boxes for having a fantastic time. Okay, so stay with me. I know that a lot of the abilities that we've chosen so far don't actually come with an active button, and this one, while it technically has a button for you to press, is only going to be one that you want to hit when you want to heal. So I promise that there will be better buttons later on, we just have to build up to them, and the Nightblade is a little bit stingy in what it offers us, at least in those first couple levels. That being said, Pneumatic Burst is going to be the first ability that we choose that you will activate when you need it, but when this button is pressed, you will get a % of your health restored, and you'll get a big chunk offensive ability along with health regenerated per second. Health regen is a very underrated stat because the more of that you build up, the easier it is to recover quickly from damage that you take, and it might be overlooked because it's often, at least in a lot of other action RPGs that I've played, not a very flashy stat. Now, Pneumatic Burst does come with a couple modifiers, but more importantly, the base skill is going to be giving you offensive ability as long as it is active. It has got a 60-second duration and an 8-second cooldown, so you basically use it all the time. More offensive ability means more opportunity to hit and more opportunity to crit, depending on how much higher your offensive ability is than your enemy's defensive ability. After that, the first modifier for Pneumatic Burst is going to do you a favor in the opposite direction, because Shadow Dance will be giving you defensive ability instead. It's also going to give you the ability to dodge and deflect attacks, which is just the fancy stat name for dodging melee and dodging ranged attacks. So basically, dodge and deflect chance goes up when you choose Shadow Dance, and the more points that you put into it, the higher the chance for you to avoid those different types of attacks. This isn't a stat that is going to happen or occur naturally on a lot of different classes, so being able to pick it up on the Nightblade, even though it is conditional for you hitting the button that is Pneumatic Burst, it is still extremely valuable for being defensive while also being offensive with everything that we're getting from Pneumatic Burst on its own. You're also going to reduce entrapment duration, so if your Pneumatic Burst is going on, you're going to lessen the amount of time that you are trapped in roots, like the big skeletal gargantuans shoot out in the Steps of Torment. And then the final modifier for Pneumatic Burst is called Elemental Awakening. This one is a little less impressive compared to the previous two options, but Elemental Awakening is still going to give you an additional amount of frostburn damage while your Pneumatic Burst is going, so 60 seconds of increased frostburn damage, and it's going to bump your elemental damage as well. More importantly than that though, this is a defensive mastery for Pneumatic Burst, which is already a defensive skill on its own, but you're getting elemental resistance because you have chosen this mastery. The more points in, the more that you'll get, but considering that elemental resistance is typically something that's pretty easy to come by, at least in the later stages of the game, you may not end up needing Elemental Awakening at all. So a couple points will do it for you early on, especially through Elite. Getting at least 15 to 20% elemental resistance out of this mastery is very good, but once you're relying on components and augments in Ultimate, we can probably just take all of the points out of Elemental Awakening and put them into other more important abilities going on in this kit. But the good news is you don't have to pick up the two masteries on Pneumatic Burst before you pick up your first offensive ability for the Nightblade, and that is our Shadow Strike. Shadow Strike is one of the best mobility options in the entire game, and the amount of damage that we're going to have it do later on in this build is pretty incredible. This ability is actually going to be one of our signature abilities for this build because of the amount of damage and mobility that we get from it, but Shadow Strike itself is going to deal 220% of your weapon damage at level 8. And you only really have to get this up to 7 because once you hit 7, you're doing a ridiculous amount of damage to enemies, at least in the normal difficulty. We'll need more points in to scale it up, but 7 is a very good place to start. You're also getting pierce and cold damage with the ability to stun a target that you jump to for 1.5 seconds. The best part of this ability by far is the option that you get to click on an enemy who is extremely far away, and as long as your character has a path to them, it will dash ridiculous ranges to get to them and use the Shadow Strike. Now there are two modifiers for Shadow Strike that we're going to be picking up, but the first one is really up to your own discretion. Shadow Strike is on a pretty decent cooldown as it stands, and the more gear that we get, the more that cooldown reduction is going to kick in. So if you want to use Nadala's Justifiable Ends, which is the further cooldown reduction of Shadow Strike, that is an opportunity. It's also going to increase the crit damage that Shadow Strike does, which is never a bad thing, but you do have to basically take points away from other parts of your build in order to fund that one. The final modifier for Shadow Strike, though, which is 100% necessary, is going to be Nightfall. Nightfall is going to add in even more weapon damage, about 49% at level 10, and this goes up to level 12. On top of that, it's going to add some more base cold damage to the attack and give it the ability to leech health from targets that you hit. You're getting frostburn damage and a chance to put the target that you hit to sleep, but even better than everything that I just mentioned, Nightfall is going to turn Shadow Strike into an AoE ability. Like I mentioned, we're at level 10 on this ability right now, and because of that, it has a 5-meter target area, which is almost as big or just as big as our Ring of Steel, which is yet another very big damage-dealing AoE in this build. That being said, though, since Shadow Strike is going to be on a very short cooldown, and we have a lot of gear later on that is going to modify Shadow Strike, being able to hit in an AoE with it is going to be very, very, very important. Now, around the time that you're picking up Shadow Strike, there is another passive that you can take on the same tier, and that is called Phantasmal Armor. Phantasmal Armor is incredibly good for what it does, even if it is very unassuming when you pick it. So Phantasmal Armor is going to give you armor, as you might have guessed, in the flat regard. It's also going to give you pierce resistance, reduced freeze duration, and reduced petrify duration. So you're going to stay frozen for less time, and you are going to be turned to stone for less time as well. You also get a 33% chance of energy leech retaliation over a 2-second period. So basically, when an enemy uses a spell on you or attacks you, you're going to have a chance to leech energy back from them and fill up your own bar. We'll also be using some soul shards for the vitality resist throughout normal to elite to ultimate. So we're going to have a lot of energy leech going on in this build to keep ourselves topped up. Phantasmal Armor is going to be absorbing energy from enemy spells as well, just on its own. So really, when you have those soul shards coupled together, if you have 2 in both of your rings, plus the Phantasmal Armor, you can get that energy absorbed from enemy spells stat quite high pretty early on. Once you've hit the next tier of ability, however, you are going to hit critical mass for your Nightblade tree in terms of the damage that you will be able to do, because we have another signature ability coming in by the name of Ring of Steel. And if you have seen any builds on this channel before that involve the Nightblade tree, you know that Ring of Steel is almost entirely worth it in every build that you can think of, because the AoE on this thing, along with the cooldown and the amount of damage that it can do, is absolutely absurd. This is an incredibly good ability for the Nightblade tree, and anything that incorporates the Nightblade probably has a good reason to pick up Ring of Steel. But the Ring of Steel itself is in a fairly large AoE around your character on a 3-second cooldown, which is incredibly short. It's actually shorter than our Shadow Strike itself, and is going to be doing the same amount of weapon damage as the Shadow Strike at level 10, which is 220% of your weapon damage. Not to mention, it's going to be doing its own piercing damage and stunning targets that it hits in a big AoE, so both Shadow Strike and Ring of Steel almost do the exact same thing with varying amounts of success. Ring of Steel is going to do it on a shorter cooldown to more enemies, but there is no movement. But considering that you can dive directly in with Shadow Strike and then Ring of Steel anyway, you can see the combo possibilities forming already. After that, there is one ability that you will take to modify Ring of Steel because we do not need the Circle of Slaughter for this build. That is ultimately one that we would take if we want to increase the crit damage and get ourselves an ability to silence enemy targets, but it's not going to be a huge problem for us because this build should have Ring of Steel and Shadow Strike doing enough damage on their own without putting a whole bunch of extra points into a mastery that isn't entirely necessary. The one that is, however, is your Ring of Frost, and this is only going to cost you 1 point because it is going to 100% convert all of the piercing damage that Ring of Steel does and turn it into cold damage instead. When Ring of Steel hits people now, it is also going to freeze them for almost 3 seconds, which is huge. So basically, as long as you're not hitting enemies with very high freeze reduction resistance, they're going to be stunned for quite a while you're standing in the middle of them, hacking them down with all of your other abilities. Speaking of getting hacked away at, you definitely don't want the bad guys doing that to you when you are caught unaware taking a whole bunch of damage. So for that reason, you're going to take 1 point into the best defensive ability in the Nightblade tree, and that is your Blade Barrier. Blade Barrier is a completely invincible button. It has a 3-second duration in which you are stun locked while you press it, but you are going to have 300 health regen per second. You can't be stunned, you can't be frozen, you can't be petrified, you can't be trapped, and you are dealing physical damage retaliation while the Blade Barrier is going. Essentially, this is your panic button, so if a boss or a very big group of enemies start sneaking big amounts of damage on you, you're going to hit your Blade Barrier, pop a potion, or just wait for your next mobility cooldown to come back so that you can get out of dodge and wait for any specific healing cooldown to come back. Blade Barrier is by and large the best ability that you can get in the Nightblade tree for a single point investment, and you're just going to need to play around that 33-second cooldown at level 1 because you really shouldn't have to use Blade Barrier all that often. It's more of an emergency get out of jail free card when you are really overestimating your abilities and underestimating the bad guys who are just running at you. We've saved almost the best for last because Execution is the final ability we're taking on the Nightblade tree. Execution is a dual blades modifier, and this is going to activate on a 22% chance when you have it maxed out at 8 out of 8 levels. It's going to deal 265% of your weapon damage along with some of its own flat cold damage, but better than both of those things, your reduction to enemies' health caps out at 23%, again, only at 8 out of 8. If you can get this bad boy overmaxed, those damage numbers are going to go up even more. So it should be fairly easy to get Execution overmaxed because it's got such a low point threshold to begin with, but there is a pretty sparse amount of gear that we'll need in this build that will acquiesce to that request. Now, as we move over to the Demolitionist tree, just remember that you can pick these abilities up interspersed with your Nightblade tree to get some early damage as well, and that is proven no better than the fact that we're taking Fire Strike as our first ability on the Demolitionist side of things. Fire Strike will replace your normal auto attack, and it is going to be dealing 116% of your weapon damage at level 9, along with its own fire damage and bumping your physical damage. Fire Strike is incredibly useful for two-handed melee builds because the attack speed that you get when using 2 weapons is double the speed that you get when using 1. So more Fire Strikes more often because 2 weapons math. First modifier that we're picking up for Fire Strike is the best modifier for it, and that is Explosive Strike. Explosive Strike is actually going to allow Fire Strike to hit in an AoE when it activates, and that is about 2.5 meter target area at level only 4 out of 12. So this can hit in a very big AoE around your character, but it only activates when you're using Fire Strike, so if you're not attacking, you're not getting that Explosive Strike to go off. It's doing a small percentage of your weapon damage yet again, and also physical and burn damage, but more importantly than those things, like I mentioned earlier, you want the AoE from Fire Strike because it's big clear to go on top of your big Ring of Steel clear, to go on top of your Shadow Strike clear, and it's just good. Everything really lines up like a very sturdy house of cards. You're also going to want to take all 3 points into the second modifier for Fire Strike, and that is Searing Strike, not to be confused with Searing Might. Searing Strike is going to have 3 points that will modify the damage of Fire Strike by 15%, meaning that you're upping the damage of the ability by 15%. You're getting 15% crit damage, and you're reducing the energy cost of the Fire Strike by 33%. So big, fancy numbers for some big, fancy stats, making Fire Strike even better as an AoE tool and to complement your cooldowns on Shadow Strike and Ring of Steel. We're not skipping passives on the Demolitionist tree though. Flame Touched is going to be the first passive that you'll pick up, and we're going to need quite a few points into this bad boy. Flame Touch is a passive that's always going to be going, just like your Veil of Shadow, and this one is going to activate in a very big radius around you, dealing fire damage while buffing fire, lightning, burn, and electrocute damage, and giving you the ever-coveted ability of offensive. It's giving you offensive ability. You get more flat offensive ability, that goes up, more crit. We're happy, we love Flame Touched. And then the modifier for Flame Touched is Temper, which is going to do just the same thing that the Pneumatic Burst is doing for us on the Nightblade tree, but it is giving us defensive ability where its predecessor was offensive. You're also getting a bump to physical, pierce, and internal trauma damage, but you're getting flat physical damage as well, so it's not the worst thing in the world just for getting some off-the-ground physical damage numbers. The final ability on our Demolitionist tree, and for the video itself, is going to be the Vindictive Flame. The modifier for Vindictive Flame is up to you. It's called Ulzwin's Wrath, and you can get away with putting 1 or 2 points in this, but if you don't want to take it, it's not going to break the build. That being said, Vindictive Flame has a 100% chance of activating, but it has a 2-second cooldown in a fairly large area around you. So basically, when you are hit, you are going to deal physical and fire damage back to the enemies that have hit you on that 2-second cooldown, with a chance to stun them and get a bunch of health regen back too. You're also getting a buff to your total speed as well as some fire retaliation, meaning that Vindictive Flame, as it is going off, is going to be doing a whole lot of buffing to your kit, while also dishing out the damage to the enemies that touch you. It is an incredibly good ability, and if you end up taking Ulzwin's Wrath for it, you can also get some lifesteal out of the ability as well. So basically, every 2 seconds that you're attacked, the damage that the ability does will be getting you some health back on top of the health regen that it's giving you. So, all of that being said, the Demolitionist does have some pretty decent passive stats for you too, meaning that the Nightblade and the Demolitionist together are just going to kiss, and they're going to marry each other, and everything is going to be happy and wonderful through Elite and Ultimate, because this build is very simple, yet very, very effective for maximum damage. But that is it for this video, the first video in the 3-part series, talking all about abilities. We're going to lay it down, pick it up, throw it out, and drag it back in, just like all the enemies in this video and the next one, and then beyond and further beyond from there. So, thanks so much for hanging out, everybody. I appreciate each and every one of you, especially everybody who added to those 60 or 70 views on the last video. Now I can breathe, and we can get on with our lives. Peace out, everybody. See you next time.